everyone. Happy Monday. My name is Erin Meyer. I'm the Sustainable Food Programs Coordinator at the University of California, Merced. We are here to talk today to Dr. Colleen C. Naughton from UC Merced. I'll let her introduce herself. She'd probably do a much better job at it. But this is an Ask Me Anything series, so feel free, and after she launches in, just ask away. All right, Colleen, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks for having me in this opportunity. My name's Colleen Naughton. I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering at UC Merced. I don't want to go too much into my bio and take all your time, and want to leave time for your questions. My research is on sustainable and culturally sensitive food, energy, water systems. I know that's a big mouthful, but some projects I do are kind of life cycle assessment, which is cradle to grave environmental impact analysis. And I've done that of shea butter production in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you have any questions about shea butter, you probably see it in lotions, even in like chocolates or Hershey's cookies and cream, I can answer that. I have a few COVID-19 related projects that my group is working on. One is related to wastewater. So if you've seen the news probably about SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 virus being detected in wastewater, we're looking at how that could impact local communities that are near wastewater treatment plants and the workers. I also do water treatment research. So one of my graduate students, Hope Hopman's on the call. We look at 1,2,3-TCP trichloropropane. It's a contaminant in the groundwater in the Central Valley. And so looking at treatment methods for that and mapping. So I do a lot of geographic information systems or mapping as part of my research. Before UC Merced, I did my graduate work at University of South Florida. I was a Peace Corps volunteer from 2009 to 2012 in Mali, West Africa, not Bali, but Mali. And I was a water and sanitation and hygiene engineer there. So any questions about West Africa or Mali specifically, there was just the big Eid Mubarak, or the Eid holiday. So I hope anyone that celebrated that had a good holiday. I'm from Michigan originally. I went to Purdue University in Indiana for undergrad. All my degrees are in civil engineering with an emphasis in environmental. And I'm also, people on this call, I think Alexis Smith is here, and Anna Grace, an undergrad and then a grad student, respectively, looking at COVID-19 impacts on our food system. So sorry, that's a bit all over the place, have a bunch of different things going on. So any questions you have related to food, water, energy, wastewater, please feel free to ask them. Thanks to all my students that are here, Alexis, Anna Grace, Ariana, Juliana, Fernando. Hopefully I'm not missing anyone for coming, but a lot of the research and work I do is not possible without the students and my group, and I may be asking them to answer some of the questions. So I don't know how this works or who calls on who.
It's kind of just a free-for-all. So if anyone has
Okay.
questions, feel free and ask them now. You can also, if you don't feel comfortable, you can type them in chat as well. And sorry in the background, you might hear my dog. That's what happens with these Zoom calls these days. So does anyone have a question?
Everyone's shy today. It's a Monday.
So for me, maybe it would be interesting to tell folks about how food waste is impacting our own kitchens. Um, if you know anything about that, or just impacting food waste in general. How is COVID impacting waste? It's broad, I know, but we can narrow it down to
Right.
consumers and also just maybe the farms and everything too.
Right. Yeah. So like what got me interested in doing COVID-19 related research to our food systems is seeing, I think a lot of you may have seen like the dumping of milk, like 3.7 million gallons, the overturning of crops just as businesses shut down, restaurants shut down. A lot of that food was destined to those supply chains and those markets, and it couldn't be easily turned to the grocery stores and smaller packaging and it was difficult to do that. So there was a lot of waste where these farmers were used to selling to a big supplier like Starbucks and like large hundreds of gallons of milk, and not getting it to the people. At the same time, we saw rising food insecurity. So we saw a lot of waste on that end. And then some related to like food hoarding or people like going to grocery stores and panic buying. And so you bought too much or whatnot and throwing away at home, and just cooking more at home, you have a lot more food scraps. I don't know if Alexis wants to chime in there with any impacts on food waste. She's been looking more at that specifically.
Hi, yes, so I'm Alexis, and I have been researching food waste this summer and how COVID is affecting that. And it's not, a lot of people think of it as maybe a food, lack of food, but it's not a lack of food, it's a lack of connections within the supply chain and actually finding where that food should go. So mainly the large effects of that food being wasted is obviously that food going directly to the landfill and producing the greenhouse gases, which we all know are a large effect on climate change. And then we are seeing this greater amount of food insecurity now caused by unemployment and the pandemic. So there's that adds into it. And then a lot of volunteers who work at food banks and things and are helping with creating those connections in the localized food supply chains are often volunteers who are older, which are people who are more at risk for COVID. And then so those types of facilities that do help with localized connections have less of a workforce now too, and that adds to food waste as well. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Great, thanks, Alexis. Anna Grace, did you have anything to add? I know we've been specifically looking at the meat supply chain, and I think you've seen meat packing plants that had COVID cases had to reduce production, and it's something emphasized, like probably 10 million hogs or more will have to be euthanized and not even make it to the table.
Hi, I'm Anna Grace. Yeah, a lot of people have been using the word pivot to explain like the agricultural sector moving away from like food services or the restaurant industry. And I think it's a difficult word because pivoting sounds really simple, but it's really hard to do from what they've been seeing a lot of farmers had to go through. And I think Alexis said it really well, that it's a lack of connections, which makes it really hard. So yeah.
Thanks, Anna Grace. And not to be like throw out these statistics and sound depressing, there have been some really great solutions that the community has come up with. I mean, we've just seen restaurants turning into grocery stores, and more localized and regional food systems, and like using more of those CSAs or community like supported agriculture boxes are thriving during this time, and people are finding those connections. It's just taken time to kind of do that. And so we're hoping in our research to kind of document these lessons learned, for the future, and just to create in general a more resilient food system that's more equitable, because our food system was sort of uh, not serving the entire country, especially Native Americans, Black and Hispanic people on low income. So now is a time, they say, don't waste a crisis, not to be diminish what's going on right now, but there's a lot that we can learn and improve. So hopefully we'll come out of this with a better and more equitable food system.
Yeah, valuable insights. Thank you. And I'm seeing the same thing anecdotally as I talk to small farmers. They're not necessarily like having to pivot, when they do, they're doing well. The CSAs are going well. We had a recent podcast guest describe the same thing. So it's kind of the larger businesses that seem to be kind of struggling for the most part. And thank you for your insights around all of that. Does anyone have additional new questions or anything?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Hi, Colleen. AMA. I'm really impressed with your work with it goes from like the global level, you're focusing, you did some research, I think you said in Africa, and then also in the Central Valley. I'm wondering, what sort of differences do you see with your work across these different cultures, regions, and systems?
Okay, thanks, Camila. Great question. And she's also an assistant professor here, so can probably add to the conversation or what she's been working on related to COVID-19 and other research. Yeah, I've like going from this kind of global to, I have shifted more of my research focus to domestic United States and the Central Valley, but there are a lot of similarities, and sometimes I get in trouble for comparing the places since, you don't want to compare the United States to a developing country, but unfortunately there's a lot of areas in the United States suffering from poverty and food insecurity and sort of inequalities that I have seen in West Africa. So there is a bit of overlap, and I'm always one to promote that it's not just, develop as, especially as a Peace Corps volunteer, it wasn't just me teaching the community. It was like I learned almost, probably more than I was able to teach them. So there's a lot of great things we can learn from each other, but I've seen a bit of overlap with, just having regulations in place, but maybe not the enforcement and sort of these kind of inequalities for lower income minority populations that suffer with lack of access to food, water, and energy, and sort of some, the solutions that we need to focus on are kind of, listening to these populations and having like effective science policy that's enforced and monitored, which of course requires money, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay.
Tommy?
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I've been wondering about ever since I moved to the Central Valley is that I see the crop dusters flying pretty much every day. I'm wondering how much have these agricultural chemicals seeped into the water, and is the water in the Central Valley safe to drink?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually, just moving here, seeing it and drive. I used to drive before like everything shut down, of course, I live in Turlock, so driving the back roads to Merced and just probably getting dusted while I'm driving in my car, which I know the environmental effects of some of those chemicals. I mean, some of them are not as harmful, and we've gotten better with restrictions or like when to spray and avoiding pesticide drift. But a lot of it has, before we got better regulations and even now has gotten into the groundwater. And there's these things called consumer confidence reports. And it's not like an economic report, it's about your water, and it's through the Clean Water Act that each municipality that provides drinking water has to monitor for certain pollutants in the water, nitrogen from fertilizers and other kind of chemicals or pesticides. And I've reviewed them in the area, and yeah, our water is not that great. But of course, if you're getting it from tap water and not like a private well, it's still required to meet certain standards. Sometimes they have exceedances. So I would recommend having like a Brita filter or, a fridge filter if you're drinking water here, but you should still be okay if you're on a well. So find out, do you get a water bill or not? If you're on a private well, I'd make sure that your landlord or yourself are sampling that well to see what's in it. And again, trying to do some of these point of use filters. You can get the reverse osmosis systems underneath your sink. But those are kind of expensive. A lot of the Brita filters, which is activated carbon in them, can remove a lot of pollutants. I would advocate, using tap water with a filter over buying bottled water most any day. But yeah, the water here is a little lower quality than the rest of the United States, unfortunately, because of like the more intensive agriculture. And even in Turlock, we have a 123. It's 123 TCP was a soil fumigant, that was applied to the soil a while ago. And we have an exceedance and they say they'll fix it in 3 years. So it's still going to be over the contaminant level that they'd like. Hope, did you have anything to add to that question?
No, I think that pretty much covered it. I think, like you said, if you don't have enough information about your particular water system that you're using to obtain your drinking water, having it independently tested and sampled if it's a domestic well, or definitely reading the confidence reports is a good idea to realize just what exactly is in the water. Because I think there is a lot of information out there, but you have to dig for it and you have to look for it to really know. And you can't rely on taste and smell alone, because a lot of these chemicals do not have any kind of taste or associated smell with them. So they really need more sophisticated analytical testing.
Yeah, so Fernando linked to the Merced one. You can find one for like pretty much, if you just look up consumer competence report, like water and your city, you should be able to find it. And they are kind of hard to read. We go over it in my introduction environmental engineering class. And it is in like parts per billion and all these different units. So I'm not sure what your background is. So they're supposed to be like publicly digestible, but if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me or let me know if they're like, ask what this means. There's also like through the California water boards and whatnot, there's ways to like look up your GPS location and kind of what kind of risk, like water quality is like more into that area. So I'm going to try to find those links and put them in the chat. But did that help answer your question? I hope I didn't scare you too much.
Yeah, that answered it. It's just that I always wonder about the water, because when it dries, it leaves this brown smudge, and I'm wondering if there's something I shouldn't be drinking.
Yeah, so a lot of the chemicals have been applied on the soil, and then they do leach into the groundwater. A lot of times the municipal wells do draw from deeper in the aquifer, so you may not get as much contamination as, say, like a shallower well or aquifer if that's like a domestic well. And there are some in California, even outside the agricultural areas and inside them, there's natural contaminants like arsenic and uranium that are existing in aquifer groundwater. And so surface water is usually of better quality that you get in LA and San Francisco, but it's not always the case. It still can get contaminated, but usually it's better. But yeah, I would just check your consumer confidence reports. I mean, the United States, like Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Water Act, like there are standards. So I know a lot of people get afraid to drink their tap water, but they do have, regulations, but it is good to provide another filter. But if you are on a domestic well, you're not getting a water bill, I would definitely like recommend testing and some other like treatment and doing it semi-regularly. I think Shay Robinson had a question. Yeah, Hope, I don't know if you can look up, I think it's through Gamma or OHHA where you can put up, I think you can put in your like coordinates or your address.
Yeah. Sure, I'll get that and put it in the chat.
Thanks. So it says, Colleen, what were your actionable takeaways from what you learned about the failures of our food system during the pandemic? What can we do as educated consumers to support a more equitable food system? Yeah, that's a great question. I know we do have kind of a list of solutions we're developing, and I know we need to get them, out there as the pandemic goes on. We're still like doing that literature review and like using data to quantify whether these are the, actionable takeaways that we need to do. I think what rises to the top is having, more of these local and regional food systems and not becoming so reliant, on very centralized, like the combined animal feeding operations, the meat packing plants. I mean, it's good to have some trade and the international trade and all be connected, but we do have to have some like redundancy, resiliency in our systems that when a crisis, a natural disaster happens, that we can get our food from other sources, because sometimes there's little tiny things in the supply chain, like tomato seeds all come from China now, mostly. And so it's like, if that's disrupted, that's a huge disruption. So we still need to support like other more local systems. Or for the meat packing plants, we found like not having, of course, these large operations and huge plants that spread disease and have bad working conditions, but support sort of more the smaller, quote unquote, mom and pop sort of meat packing or meat processing facilities. And it used to be in your grocery store, you could go and there was a butcher there. So some of these things aren't as economical for companies to have it more distributed, but it is in the end more economical for the country. So I think more regional and local food systems for equity. There has been especially a lot of emphasis on that. And so even with having local and regional systems that can be more equitable, we've just seen a lot of issues, especially Native American populations that have to, of course, drive to get their water. It's really dry. They're in food deserts where it's hard, it takes a long time to get to a grocery store, and we saw empty shelves here, so you can only imagine how it was in smaller communities. And so Native Americans used to grow like a lot of their own food and like very healthy, nutritious food. But because of the regulations we put in place for food safety to protect us, but it also hinders sometimes more like local adaptable systems that aren't trying, not going to contaminate or be like unclean. So in some cases we put regulations in place and they're only designed for large companies. So we need to think of the small farms and the small producers and what regulations and policies make sense for them, if that makes sense. Shea Robinson. So I don't know, Anna Grace, did you have more to add to that question?
I'd say that one of the easier things that we as consumers can do is vote with your fork. And so every time you purchase a product in general, but with your food especially, you can make sure that you're supporting those systems or those ideas that you I recently ordered deliveries online from a grocery store, and the grocery store could have you filter goods through like free fair trade or like ethical sustainability different measures. And I thought that was really cool. And so every day when you purchase food, you can make sure that you're supporting those systems. And I think especially with all of the technology that we've been using recently is that we now have the means to learn so much more. This summer, by just joining this project, I've learned so much because of all of the webinars that I now have access to. And so I think it's also a great opportunity to take advantage of all of the workshops and webinars that are happening now, that we can more easily learn or be exposed to what's going on in these small ways that we as consumers can then support these food systems.
Yeah, thanks, Anna Grace. That's a really good point. Can you put in the Purdue website too for resilient food? Or that's a good one to go to before we get to our publications and more of our getting the information out there. But I know it can be overwhelming as a consumer to know what the right thing to buy is, and we're still improving labeling. I know there's the organic labeling, and I mean some fair trade, and it's hard to make a decision. So just do what you can. As Anna Grace said, attend webinars when you can, learn what you can. I learned through my shea butter research how bad palm oil is for the environment. Mass deforestation of rainforest and killing of orangutans, but it's hard to avoid palm oil. That's some things. So we as consumers vote with your wallet, but also contact your congressman or woman, your senator. Like I was in a science and technology policy fellowship in DC, and we learned a lot more, about contacting your representatives and policy, and they do have to listen. Sometimes they give you a form letter response, but they have to note that down. So if enough people eventually push, it does make a difference. And it's just a short form on their website, or you can tweet at them, or just get your voice heard, not just voting for that person, but or voting for the people in power, but also no matter who's in power, making sure you're getting your voice heard. And unfortunately, that's a lot of times the older generation that's more used to that. So we need the younger, like us, younger generation to speak our voice. And I think a lot of that's happening now. So hopefully that answered your question. I think you had a follow-up. But I think yes to your follow-up question about supporting local systems. Yeah, support them both monetarily and through petitions and donations, and going to your local farmers market. I think it's still safe outdoors with masks, and they're putting a lot of things in place, so it's better to try to support your local grocery store, your local area, more so than maybe Amazon or like some of the big chains. But sometimes, of course, you can't avoid that, but there's businesses through those chains you can support. I think I'll get to Jeannie Boyer's question. Do you have any information about what may be happening with infrastructure for composting in California? I have heard the VT, I don't know, is it Virginia, is requiring composting for residential households, and some towns in MA provide the service for a fee. Jeannie, those acronyms mean certain areas, counties in California or states? Just making sure. Okay, yeah, Vermont and Massachusetts. Yeah, so Alexis I'll divert this question quickly to Alexis, who's done a lot of looking into the local legislation in California. The number, AB, whatever is escaping me, she might know, is requiring a certain amount of diversion, like 75% of organic waste in California. So there is a lot of infrastructure now and plants, and I mean, COVID has kind of restricted that in some ways, but it's still happening. But sort of the monitoring and regulations of that is still a little loose, but it is shifting to more composting in California. Alexis, do you have more to add?
Yes, definitely. So I know exactly what you're talking about with Vermont and Massachusetts, because I have been reading that, and I did see an article about Vermont and saying that they are having a new regulation, but that keeping a hold of it and actually maintaining it and enforcing it is another issue entirely, especially during the pandemic. And then the regulation in California that Colleen was referencing is AB 1826, and it's for businesses only. It's not for households at the moment, even though that one in Vermont is for households, even though it's not being entirely enforced. But the one in California is being enforced for businesses. As of right now for COVID, it's kind of looser, not as stringent at the moment, and the goal was for 2020 to meet the goal. So we'll see at the end of the year when CalRecycle comes with that data to see what happened, because this was the year that they're supposed to report back. But yeah, definitely. I know exactly what you're talking about with Vermont, because that has been a very interesting situation to read what they're doing with monitoring households. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis, for saving me there for that. Yeah, I mean, it depends also on your area. So I'd look up your local, not just recycling, like CalRecycle on the website. You can go and find kind of these local facilities, not just the landfill, but I mean, the Highway 59 landfill by campus in Merced has windrow composting there. In Turlock, in our bins, we're allowed to put organic food waste in them, but I get kind of nervous about that because I don't want to like contaminate the bin too much or like make it all smelly and gross. I'd like a bit more of a separate bin, but I'll probably move to doing that. You can also do a lot of household composting, and they have the rotating drums you can buy for your backyard that are enclosed. And I think Hope looked up little things you can do at home, like even in your home, have little composting and apply it on your yard. So there's things you can do just at your yard, but it is nice to kind of aggregate it on a municipal level and create that compost and even derive energy from it, or put it back on the farms and kind of create this like closed, circular kind of waste system, or not even like we shouldn't really be labeling things as waste or not. So we're just going to. But yeah, I went to Vancouver. I went for a conference there, and it was even in all the hotel rooms, they had this like little green tiny bin where you could put like your apple core and your banana peel, and it was like also like your waste basket. It was just like they had a great organic recycling system. So I hope we can get there one day as a state and as a country. And it seems like Vermont and Massachusetts are probably even leading us than more, even though California is usually the leader on a lot of environmental things. So I hope that answered your question. Feel free to follow up, Jean. So Craig was asking if we can talk more on the work on wastewater and COVID-19 in the region. So Merced is, there's some professors, Mark Sistrom and Mark Boutel and Michael Beeman, that are more lab-based researchers that have gotten some initial funding to start testing outside of Merced's campus. So that'll be good to get some kind of data. They hope to test at the Merced wastewater treatment plant. So I don't think there have been some companies, and I'll let Fernando add a little bit after this. There is like BioBot Analytics that may be sampling, or CDM Smith that might be sampling more in the area. I know UC Davis is going to start sampling more in Sacramento. There's a lot of sampling going on in LA. There's some recent articles that came out. UC Berkeley, Karen Nelson has been sampling throughout San Francisco. So off of the Berkeley campus, they found also higher concentrations near the prison, San Quentin, and some other neighborhoods. So there's a lot going on of work in wastewater. And we had a UC system-wide meeting with professors either doing or thinking of doing monitoring on their campus. So we're trying to all coordinate better to kind of use it as an early warning system. So don't always trust the articles you see that say like, we found this amount of concentration of the virus, there's this many cases. It's not there yet. It's just another tool in the toolbox. It can predict like a rise in outbreak, like a rise in cases, like 3 to 7 days before you see the cases come after testing. So that is good. And it's good. It'll be good for like when there's lower cases. And so it'll be if when students return to campus and we have more like in-person classes, and if we have the outbreak under control, it'd be good to have the wastewater monitoring as well to see if there's a rise in the concentrations in the wastewater. Then we might be like, oh, we should look at this, or we should have more physical distancing, or we need less people. And so you should use it in combination with contact tracing, with cases. But it's good to see, people can emit the virus when they're asymptomatic, and they also can emit it like before they start showing, which is asymptomatic, but you can be asymptomatic throughout the whole term of the virus, and you can also just be, you just got the virus and you're not sick yet. So you still excrete virus during that time, so it can detect that. So that's good, because you might be going to work and think you're fine, but you're passing it on to people. So it's a way to detect it in the water, and they're trying to move to more like building level and campus level testing, but there's a lot of variability, when someone flushes the water, and how are you going to collect that sample? So it's good at the treatment plant level, where everything kind of comes together and you can get a representative sample. So it's harder at smaller scales. So I know I'm going off on a tangent. I love talking about wastewater, but there's a lot going on. It's not as widespread as we'd like it, or as it is in Europe and other places. But the CDC is trying to put like a sewage monitoring system in place. Wastewater testing has been used for the polio virus and for monitoring opioids. So it's not anything that's new, really. It's just the virus is new. So Fernando, is there anything you wanted to add for Craig's question that I missed?
Well, I think that was a great answer. I would also furthermore like to add that Utah has been measuring SARS-CoV-2 detection in sewage and has created a map of sewage detection in Utah along with Arizona State University. And BioBot has been working with MIT and Harvard to create a national COVID-19 map where people can send in samples.
Yeah, so BioBot's this great, like, big company, but they did, I think you might have seen the Yosemite article that they like monitor the sewage in Yosemite after Yosemite opened back up, and they're like, there's like 170 cases. So that was a little bit probably too precise. And so they are a great company, but just if you see, don't be alarmed if you see SARS-CoV-2 in your wastewater. Like, it happens. You shouldn't shut everything down, but it's a good predictor. And they're still working on like the actual correlation between cases and the concentration of wastewater, because not everyone sheds the virus. And we don't know yet if it's going to be infective. So what we're looking at is, because wastewater treatment plants can sometimes be right next to communities, and you use treatment processes like activated sludge, which aerate the wastewater to treat it, and that can spread pathogens. It spread other viruses and bacteria. We don't know if it can spread SARS-CoV-2 yet. In people's feces and urine, they found it infective, but to get to a wastewater treatment plant, it has to go through all the sewage system. It's very dilute with other water, and SARS-CoV-2 is luckily destroyed by UV and other, like it's not very resilient once in the environment. That's why you don't see as much outdoor spread. But there's still a risk if your community is like right there, or if you're a wastewater treatment worker that's dealing with this sewage every day. So if you do live near a wastewater treatment plant, you might want to avoid, like, 6 to 8 p.m. when there's not much sunlight, maybe when there's a peak amount of water, since when wastewater treatment plants get their highest loads right after the morning, when people like shower and get up and flush their toilets, it takes a while to get there. And also when they return home. I mean, now people aren't commuting. I mean, there's still some of that, but there's still people still kind of follow a morning and evening schedule, maybe after dinner. But I can link to the, is there any other questions? I'm glad to hear that Modesto has a great composting program with classes. That's nice. I did backyard composting in Florida. It was a little harder there with more of a humid environment and bugs and a lot of cockroaches. You're not supposed to have that in your compost, because it's supposed to be dry and high temperatures, but sometimes when it rains and things get anaerobic, and yeah. Yeah, hopefully that answered your question, Craig, wasn't too tangential. So if you have more follow-ups, let me know. Yale has like a cool COVID tracker website also, and I'll put the general wastewater-based epidemiology website. I can find it. That has like a map and the publications. And we have a Twitter handle at COVID Poops 19 that I just like, our group retweets any like wastewater COVID-19 related research. So there was recently a Daily Show episode about BioBot analytics and their testing, which was kind of cool to watch. I can link to BioBot if you guys want. Any other questions? So this is not, an endorsement of their company, but they are doing a lot of work. Yeah, Clemson. So there is this, we were at the UC meeting, and they're kind of worried about releasing the data about wastewater and like scaring people. But like, I feel it needs to be open and to the public. I mean, we see Johns Hopkins University has a great kind of case map, and Merced County is pretty interactive. I think it's good to give people the data and they can search for it, but just remember that, you know, the concentration data in the wastewater isn't like as concrete as, say, the number of cases and hospitalizations. Again, it's just something else you can, you know, use to track the virus, but it is in our environment, it is in our, you know, water. It doesn't necessarily mean that you should be afraid of drinking your water. The wastewater treatment process is like very much like inactivates the virus with the UV and other systems. So just, you know, if you see websites with that information, don't be like scared of it. There's all sorts of, even though there are some standardized ways of testing for it in the wastewater, there are a lot of variations in like how people sample, and all wastewater is different. There's different flow rates, different amount of populations served. So they're still working on how to kind of compare that data and to standardize the testing more. So you might see very different values in very different places, and that doesn't mean the science is bad or the testing is bad. It's just, you know, different. So it's easier to like compare concentrations in the wastewater at that plant, like over time, than to compare one plant to the other. So it's good to look for trends within that plant, but maybe not between different plants. If there's any other questions or anyone that wants to introduce themselves or share why they're here or anything they're working on that they feel others should know. I don't want to take up the spotlight, so.
Hey, Colleen, this is Guillermo Ortiz. I'm the Sustainability and Diversity Educational Programs Manager here at UC Merced in the Office of Sustainability. My general question, I think you mentioned before that part of the work that you do is life cycle analysis. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you kind of describe that work and that kind of how, to what degree, like that is, you've used that to assist maybe some of the university's sustainability efforts?
Yeah, sure. I'm still like working on like my university projects as I've been here a year and a half now. But life cycle assessment, for those that don't know, as I said, like kind of cradle to grave environmental impact. So I kind of use the example of a coffee maker. So it's not just, you know, the electricity and the water you're using, like making your coffee, but it's the coffee maker itself is made of plastics and metals that had to be mined and that had to be like manufactured, usually in developing countries, same with the mining sometimes. And so all those have emissions associated with it. And then there's the end of life. So it's like, you know, your coffee maker eventually ends up in a landfill, usually somewhere, and is like contributes to it degrades and might pollute the groundwater, or it contributes to air pollution. So it's really evaluating products or food or processes throughout their entire life cycle, instead of like the use phase, like a TV. It's not just the electricity it uses and the CO2 associated with what fossil fuels or whatever your energy mix you're using. It's also, again, the materials that went into making that product, the manufacturing, and what happens end of life. So on campus, again, working with Alexis, she's going to be the GFI, right? The global, the food fellowship. Sorry, Alexis can use the right term, but she'll be looking at the Bobcat Eats program and doing a life cycle analysis, looking more to quantify the kind of environmental impact. Yeah, Global Food Initiative, sorry, my brain is on the spot. So, so kind of quantifying how the food diverted, the CO2 saved, But sometimes if you just do a strict, carbon footprint analysis, like within, as I said, like the use phase, you might not take into account the transportation it took to deliver that food or rescue that food. You might not take into account fridges that you need to kind of store the food. And you might not take into account that if you donate that food to that person, are they consuming 100% of that food or are they wasting it again? So trying to like look more from a life cycle perspective to quantify all the impacts, not saying that it's not a good program and that it didn't save, it's probably still saving a lot, but to look, so you can use life cycle assessment to look across the life cycle of a program, a project, a food like process, and you can look where you need to reduce the environmental impact. So maybe getting more energy efficient fridges, which you probably have, or like decreasing, like changing the routes to reduce transportation, or making sure it's the food that they're actually, going to consume. So that might be ways to improve, or it's a way to actually just quantify how much you're saving. But that's what I'd like to do with the sustainability and on campus. And we were looking at also sorting the food waste from the pavilion before this whole COVID hit. I still have a proposal through the Environmental Research and Education Fund, EREF, that would do some sorting of the food waste from campus to see like what's most being wasted. And you can use life cycle there to kind of look at different programs you could implement to reduce food waste, or you could just look at kind of the waste composition and how much emissions is associated with that. So those are kind of things I wanted to do with sustainability on campus. I do have a student who's not on the call, but Brooklyn, who's looking at life cycle assessment of figs in California, so that's not on campus. And then I'm working with a student in New Mexico on pecans and so California has like anywhere from 200 to 400 crops, different crops, and not all of them have life cycle assessment. So Alexis, did you want to add anything?
Definitely. So LCA isn't like, I don't want it to sound like it's calling anyone out or saying anything bad. It's a place that like helps to improve and find what's going well and what could be improved upon, and just seeing the overall impact that programs are having and products are having, because it's not just what you immediately see. There's background processes that you don't obviously see every day in your daily life. That's the part that I find most interesting, but yeah, that's my personal like input.
Yeah, I mean, life cycle assessment it can seem overwhelming and like, why do you need all this information? But I mean, a number of us, Alexis, Brooklyn, myself, and others in my group, like a lot of spreadsheets and like taking part of the process is a life cycle inventory and just, noting everything. And like, there's softwares you can use, SimaPro or Gabby, to do the analysis once you have the quantities of things. So I find it interesting to just see, if you read books about like how stuff works, or like just to see like what goes into a process or a program, or like even I learned so much about, making shea butter, or I'm learning a lot about figs now, like that I didn't know before. So it's just kind of a way to learn about something, and then like, yeah, how you can improve it and make it more sustainable. Not saying it's, bad to start off with, but we can always improve, or you can also just at least have the quantity to be like, oh, well, we're better than this, or better than what the status quo would have been, and by how much. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks. Great
Yeah.
questions, everyone.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm particularly excited about it to analyze this program, because when you're looking at food programs and creating these programs like I do, you want to make sure that they're sustainable in every sense of the word, economically, environmentally, and socially. So LCA really allows you to do that, because it looks at the environmental impacts in a variety of different ways. Of course, it's harder to measure also the social and the economic, but it's a really good way to just learn about if the program is having a neutral, positive, or negative impact, just in a variety of ways. So we're going to use it to hopefully help aid our program in a variety of ways. So thank you, Alexis and Colleen, for helping me with that.
Yeah, and thanks to the Office of Sustainability and everyone for working with me and like being able to integrate this research. I really appreciate it. And I know it takes a lot of time to do this kind of analysis.
So you mentioned that there's a lot of crops, obviously, that are not being studied. So what kind of LCAs do you see going forward in California that would be helpful for us?
Yeah, so I mean, done, like we saw figs just, well, I worked through Washington, D.C. when I worked there. I was traveling to Morocco and Tunisia a lot and actually buying figs, and I realized they're in California. So I was just any product I come in contact with, sometimes I look at the literature and see if there's a life cycle assessment. So that's why I looked into that. And because figs are very long-lived, they're very nutritious, and so not to be biased against figs, but they also have carbon sequestration. They don't use as much water as, say, almonds, but I think Brooklyn has found through research that the acreage of figs has decreased by half in a very short time in California. So we're seeing, and you know, rightly so, with I think if you've all heard of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and kind of the droughts in California, we are seeing some contraction of agriculture. It's nice to have a diversity of crops, but also there's some labor restrictions, and the environmental restrictions in California makes it more expensive to operate here. But to get to your question, so almonds have a lot of LCA work done there, so I don't think there'll be much done. I also worked with a student, Kirtana, through a student success intern, advised by Stefano Foresti, sorry, not forestry, on tomatoes. So fresh tomatoes, there's a lot of work done on processed tomatoes, but not fresh. So looking between those. So it's more been, there's a lot of crops I'd like to do, but it's more looking for the partnerships and the need, because you have to get a lot of this data. There's a lot of data available through the ag extension, but it's not always detailed enough. So what I'll want to do and what I can do are kind of based on, I like to do community-based participatory research. So I am going to the Merced County Farm Bureau meetings, trying to interact with farmers through community events and just make those connections. So there are a lot of Hmong farmers and Asian, like farmer of Asian descent that have a lot of specialty crops that might be interesting. So I don't really have the direct answer or a list of crops lined up now. I mean, doing LCAs are very, very time intensive. So the figs and the fresh tomatoes are a lot right now, but as like I get those initial LCAs published, and hopefully there'll be some more interest. And as Aaron brought up, the social and economical side, part of what I'm trying to branch out to, and I did a partial social life cycle assessment of shea butter, is there's the social LCA or SLCA and the life cycle costing, which is environment. And so what I've been mostly talking about is environmental life cycle assessment, so ELCA. So for the 3 pillars of sustainability, usually have people like planet, profit, or like economic, environmental, and social. And so if you can do a life cycle assessment for economics, social, and environment, you can have a complete like sustainability picture, because you might recommend a certain better environmental practice, but it's way too expensive. And so you really want to see those trade-offs. So that's where I see my research program going, not just with, you know, making sure people have adequate access to food and water, but kind of the sustainable, and through like sustainable life cycle assessment. So I hope that answers your question. But if anyone has crops or things they're interested in or things they've seen in California that they recommend, I'm always open to ideas.
So if someone wanted to learn more about LCAs from like an introductory level, where would you direct them? Do you have a good intro book, or maybe website that you really like?
Yeah, there's like the CTAC Life Cycle Initiative website. SimaPro is like the software, but it's not really an introductory. Marie Odell Fortier is teaching like a life cycle assessment class starting in the fall, but it is graduate level or upper undergrads, which would be good. I mostly look at, it's really, you go by the ISO international standards and operations, ISO 2006 standard. Let me look it up. It's ISO 14040, but that's like kind of hard to, it's not that digestible and you have to pay for it. I learned through like a graduate level class, but really I kind of look up like journal articles, and through the university, of course, we get access, but there's still a lot of open source things, or you can always email the author. So I just like look up different life cycle assessments of different products or crops that I'm interested in. Like I started looking at LCAs of plastic versus paper bags, like because I was interested in that, or plastic, paper, and reusable. And so you kind of learn about LCA by just seeing what different people do. So I'll put the standard and the CTAC website. But just anything, it's the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment. So if you have any product or anything you're interested on, like a lot of things have LCAs now that you can look up and kind of learn. But there are a lot of people doing LCAs that it's not always the best quality. So you just really need to look at how much, are they taking the entire life cycle into account, and are they looking at more than just one category? Like if they're just looking at carbon, that's a carbon footprint. That is not a life cycle assessment necessarily. So I put those links. You can put SimaPro. SimaPro is unfortunately kind of expensive. There is Open LCA, but I haven't tried it yet. That's supposed to be more open, and the USDA also has like I think a database of all the different crops that they have LCAs on. Sorry, it's my... Oh, the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment. Oh, yeah, that's on there. Okay.
Thank you. That's so helpful. Yeah. I've got a question, but we've got 2 minutes. So anyone else have any awesome questions for Dr. Naughton? All right, I'll give the final question then. If you had a magic wand, and you could change anything about our food system, what would it be, and why?
Oh, jeez. You needed to provide me this question before. No, I wanted. I mean, I think my gut reaction is to kind of change these sort of combined feeding operations for animals. We've seen meat is like a huge contributor to greenhouse gases, and like a lot of the lagoons and wastes and antibiotic resistance, and it's not to say to demonize the ranchers and farmers that own these operations. It's a holistic like policy solution, and we need to pay more for our food and eat less meat or no meat to kind of create like a more sustainable system. So I would be in the favorite, if I could change something, it would be kind of these combined animal feeding operations and making it more of, you know, not just grass-fed or free range or like more humane system for our animals, because that would also change, because a lot of our food is grown for animals, so that would also have ripple effects throughout the rest of the food system, and I think be able to provide more food for more people. Great and tough question.
But I love that answer. It's beautiful and brilliant because it does hit on so many things. If we could do that, so many problems would be solved from an ethical standpoint. Oh, sorry, my dog. From an ethical standpoint, a social standpoint, and environmental. So, yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful answer. Any final questions for anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I know Aaron, or I'm not a vegetarian or vegan. I'd love to be. I've tried to be. It's difficult being an athlete. Not to say it's not impossible. There's plenty of weightlifters that are vegan, so it's part of my own laziness, I would say. But I have significantly reduced my meat consumption and the type of meat. I'm not doing red meat. So I'm sharing that to everyone to say, like, you don't have to be like the perfect pillar. It's great the people are. I think Hope in my research group is a vegan as well, and I have a lot of respect for people that do that, but there are ways you can reduce your impact, you know, not just with cutting everything out as well.
Thank you. All right. Well, for sake of time, I want to respect everyone's time. We will wrap up. And I will put out a recording of this as well as some other resources via email. Thank you all so much for taking some time on a Monday to listen to this fascinating discussion. Plant-based for the win. I love that, Juliana. In the chat, plant-based for the win. Totally agree. I would air 5 you if I were around you right now. Anyway, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who attended. Just stay tuned for next month's AMA. The guest is to be determined, but thank you all, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks.